There are crimes that happen in dark alleys, crimes that happen behind locked doors, and then there are crimes that happen in the one place you're told is sacred. A man was inside his own apartment. A normal night. The television on. A bowl of ice cream on the counter. Nothing about that moment suggested danger. And then an off-duty police officer walked into the wrong home and fired. Not during a chase. Not in a street confrontation. But inside a living room. In a place that should have been safe. That's the shock. But the deeper horror came afterward. Because once this happened, the story didn't become a mistake. It became a test. A test of how a system responds when the person who pulls the trigger carries the authority of the state, whether or not they're on duty. This is the story of Botham Jean, a 26-year-old accountant from St. Lucia, living and working in Dallas, killed inside his own home. And this is also the story of what followed. A courtroom moment of forgiveness that stunned the world and split public opinion. A key witness who testified and was killed days later, igniting fear, suspicion, and a second wave of outrage. A case that refused to end with a verdict, continuing through appeals, parole fights, and a massive civil judgment. Around the country and around the world, people heard the same explanation. She thought it was her apartment. And many asked the same question. Does that explain everything? Or does it raise even more? Today, we're following what we can confirm, step by step, from the night Botham Jean was killed, to the aftermath that made this case impossible to forget. Welcome to Dark Trace Crime Stories, where we examine not only what happened, but how it happened. If you believe accountability should outweigh privilege, tap like so this story reaches more people who need to see it.
You saw someone?
Yes, I thought it was my apartment. I'm Oh my God. I'm sorry.
On September 6, 2018, in Dallas, Texas, police officer Amber Geiger returns back to her apartment complex after a 13-hour shift. But she doesn't go to her unit on the 3rd floor. Instead, she ends up on the 4th floor.
I'm an off-duty officer. I thought it was in my apartment, and I shot a guy thinking it was my apartment.
In reality, it was the home of her 26-year-old neighbor, Botham Jean. Investigators would conclude that at the time Geiger entered the unit, Jean was on the couch eating ice cream. Evidence would even suggest that Jean may have been in a cowering or ducking position when shot. So then why did Geiger shoot him? She later said she thought Jean was an intruder and her life was in danger.
To understand why this case hit so hard, you have to understand who Botham Jean was, not through polished tributes or headlines, but through the ordinary details that made his death feel like a violation, not just a loss. Botham Jean was born in Castries, St. Lucia. To his family and friends, he was simply Bo. From a young age, his life was shaped by faith and community. Church wasn't just something he attended, it was where he sang, where he led, where people learned they could rely on him. He was known for being calm, thoughtful, and consistent. Not loud, not flashy, just steady. He wasn't famous. He wasn't powerful. But he was a kind of person who quietly becomes central to the people around him. Because he shows up, because he listens, because he carries responsibility without needing recognition. That carried into his education. Botham earned a scholarship to Harding University, where he studied business and accounting. He graduated, built lasting relationships, and stayed closely connected to the people who knew him there. Friends later described him as disciplined, generous, and deeply intentional about the life he was building. After graduation came the move that should have marked the beginning of a long, stable adulthood. He relocated to Dallas, Texas, and began working as an accountant at PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the most respected firms in the world. Public reporting described him as someone on a serious professional path, with structure, ambition, and long-term plans. And this matters, not as resume padding, but for one simple reason. This was not someone drifting toward danger. This was not someone caught in the wrong place. This was not a chaotic life intersecting with violence. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, at home, after work, inside his own apartment. And when he was killed, his family, his parents, his younger brother, weren't just grieving privately. They were pulled into a public, legal, and cultural reckoning where the most basic fact had to be said again and again. Botham Jean was in his home. Hold on to that. Because what happens next, what follows that ordinary night, is the reason this case never stopped unsettling people, even after the verdict was read.
The memory of his voice still echoes through the sanctuary. The notes from his last Sunday school lesson left untouched.
Members of the Dallas West Church of Christ say that whether he was leading worship there in the pulpit or just seated here in the pews, Botham Jean lived a life of service and purpose.
Botham was a very charismatic young man. If you knew him, you loved him.
This part of the story doesn't unfold slowly. There's no gradual warning. It drops. The date was September 6th, 2018. Botham Jean returned to his apartment complex in Dallas after work. Nothing about the night stood out. No reported arguments. No signs of conflict. Just an ordinary evening ending where it always did. At home. Later that night, Amber Geiger, an off-duty Dallas Police Department officer, arrived back at the same complex after a long shift, widely reported as lasting about 13 and a half hours. She lived in the same building. Not next door. Not across the hall. One floor below him. According to her account, later presented in court, she parked her vehicle on the wrong floor and approached the wrong apartment, Botham Jean's. This is where people often search for a cinematic explanation. Was the door open or closed? What exactly did she see? What did he say? Did he stand up? Did he move? Those questions get asked again and again. But the facts we're anchoring to are the ones that survived scrutiny, in court, in testimony, and in legal findings. What remains consistent is this. Amber Geiger entered Botham Jean's apartment. She encountered him inside his home. She drew her service weapon, and she fired. Botham Jean was unarmed. He was struck by gunfire and later pronounced dead at Baylor University Medical Center. Within moments of the shooting, Geiger called 911 and reported she had shot someone she believed was an intruder, repeatedly telling the dispatcher she thought she was in her own apartment. At the same time she was talking to the dispatcher, prosecutors later showed the jury that she also sent text messages to her police partner, Martin Rivera, saying, "I need you, hurry," and F***ed up. Those texts were entered into evidence and highlighted during the trial, where the prosecution emphasized them as part of how Geiger responded in the minutes after the fatal shots were fired. And this is where the case stopped being only about a shooting and became about how stories are framed. Because immediately, two narratives collided. One version was simple and devastating. A man was killed inside his own home. The other version arrived just as fast. An officer said she believed she was in her own apartment. And underneath those two stories sat the question that never went away. Not just, was it a mistake? But, what happens when a mistake is armed? Because fear by itself isn't the standard. The standard is response. Did you pause? Did you verify where you were? Did you disengage? Did you retreat? Did you call for help? Did you use the training designed for moments exactly like this? In the prosecution's case, and in how the trial was argued, one of the central claims was that Amber Geiger failed to follow basic law enforcement protocols before using lethal force, including disengaging and seeking backup. As investigators processed the scene, another shift began, one that had nothing to do with ballistics or floor plans. Details from a search warrant became public. Among the items listed, marijuana found inside Botham Jean's apartment. Almost immediately, his family's attorneys pushed back, publicly and forcefully. The concern wasn't about legality. It was about narrative. Because now attention was subtly shifting. From why an officer entered the wrong apartment and fired, to what was found inside the victim's home. Let's be absolutely clear. None of that changed the central facts. Botham Jean was in his apartment. He was unarmed. And he was killed. But the moment that detail entered the public record, many people recognized a familiar pattern. One that doesn't erase what happened, but tries to blur where sympathy is supposed to land. And that pattern is exactly why this case didn't stay contained to one city, one courtroom, or one verdict. Because, for many watching, this no longer felt like an isolated tragedy. It felt like something they had seen before.
He saw someone? Yes, I thought it was my apartment. I'm Oh my God. I'm sorry. I'm an off-duty officer. I thought it was in my apartment, and I shot a guy thinking it was my apartment.
This is where we stop talking in generalities. Because the systemic failure here wasn't one single action. It was a sequence of moments, some legal, some cultural, where the public watched institutions decide what story would be told. Initially, Geiger was charged with manslaughter, a decision that triggered immediate public scrutiny, protests, and debate, especially because she was a police officer and Botham was a young black man killed in his own home. Then, later, a grand jury indicted her on murder charges. That shift matters, because it marks a point where the legal system acknowledged what many people were already saying. This wasn't just careless. This was a death caused by a decision so extreme it deserved the highest level of scrutiny. At trial, the defense position centered on the belief she was facing an intruder in her apartment. The prosecution position centered on failures, entering without certainty, not retreating, not calling for backup, and choosing to shoot. And then, October 1st, 2019, the verdict. A Dallas County jury found Amber Geiger guilty of murder. The next day, October 2nd, 2019, the sentence. 10 years in prison. Now here is where justified outrage splits into two directions, both real, both understandable. For some, the conviction itself was historic and rare. A police officer convicted of murder for killing a civilian. For others, the sentence felt like the system was still cushioning the fall. 10 years for a life taken inside a home. And if you want to understand why this case never stopped sparking debate, you have to understand what happened in the courtroom during sentencing. The moment that stunned the world, Botham's younger brother, Jean, gave a victim impact statement and expressed forgiveness. Words that were widely reported because they were so unexpected in that setting. He addressed Amber Geiger directly. He said he forgave her. He said he did not want her to go to prison. He said he believed his brother would want her to find peace by giving her life to Christ. And then he asked the judge if he could hug her. The judge agreed. He walked across the courtroom and embraced her. People saw that moment and felt completely different things. Some saw grace. Some saw pain. Some saw a faith-driven act of spiritual survival. Others saw a system that always seems to demand emotional performance from black families, forgiveness, composure, dignity, while institutions still struggle to deliver accountability at the same intensity. And then it escalated again, because the judge herself, Tammy Kemp, also hugged Geiger and gave her a Bible, a move that became controversial enough to draw ethics complaints and national discussion about courtroom boundaries. That's not a side plot. That's part of the case's emotional architecture. Because to many viewers, it felt like the system was offering comfort to the convicted, publicly, while the victim's family was expected to carry their grief quietly. Right here, pause and tell me, did that forgiveness moment hit you as powerful, or did it feel like it shifted attention away from accountability? And why? I want your honest take in the comments. Now, if this story ended here, it would already be unforgettable. But it didn't end here. Because the case had one more escalation, one that arrived like a warning shot to the public's trust. During the trial, prosecutors called civilian witnesses, including a neighbor who lived across the hall from Botham Jean. His name was Joshua Brown. He testified about what he heard, voices, the sequence, the aftermath, and reporting notes that he said he did not hear Geiger give certain verbal commands before the shots, a detail that mattered because it collided with the idea of a controlled, protocol-driven police response. And then the calendar flipped into something almost cinematic. On October 4th, 2019, just days after the murder conviction and sentencing, Joshua Brown was shot and killed in Dallas. We don't have to invent anything here. There's no need to whisper conspiracies. And no need to dramatize it with fake dialogue. Because the timing alone did what it always does. It lit a fuse. People asked, was he targeted? People demanded, who benefits from a witness being dead? They called for an independent investigation because trust was already cracked. Now, here's what the official investigation said. Dallas police announced that Brown's killing was unrelated to his testimony. They described it as a drug deal that turned deadly, and reporting from outlets like ABC News and the Associated Press identifies suspects and the police narrative of how the confrontation escalated. Arrest warrants were issued for 3 suspects from Louisiana, and police publicly connected the event to a planned drug purchase. That is the official statement. That is what was presented to the public. But the public reaction, the reason this became a second twist, was rooted in context. Because earlier in the case, the marijuana detail in Botham's apartment had already sparked backlash and accusations of victim blaming. So when Brown's death was also framed through a drug narrative, many people didn't hear case closed. They heard a familiar pattern. Shift the focus. Stain the person. Quiet the uncomfortable questions. And here is the most honest way to hold the line between outrage and facts. We can report the timing. We can report the official explanation. We can report that distrust was real and widespread. But we do not invent a connection that authorities said they did not find. Still, even if you accept the official explanation, the message many viewers took was chilling. In cases involving police, the space around the courtroom can become dangerous, socially, politically, emotionally, and people who touch the truth can end up exposed. That's not speculation. That's the atmosphere this case created. And it's why the story didn't stop when the judge's gavel came down.
I can't say I seen him. I heard him in there.
Okay, when you say you heard him, what did you mean?
Heard him singing every morning.
Okay, you heard him singing. What kind of things did you hear him sing?
Gospel music, Drake.
And your door is directly across the hall from where Mr. John's apartment was, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And so in the mornings, were you inside of your apartment when you heard Mr. John singing, or outside of your apartment?
I'll probably hear him when I come out, lock my door. I'll hear him.
Okay, so from in the hallway, you can hear his activities inside his apartment?
Mm-hmm.
Yes? You have to say it out loud, I'm sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
Now approach, Your Honor.
Yes. Here.
Thank you.
After the conviction, Amber Geiger appealed. Courts upheld the conviction. Then came parole, another chapter that reopened the wound. Geiger became eligible for parole in late September 2024, and in October 2024, parole was denied. Multiple outlets reported the denial and that the next review would be in 2026. And the parole denial matters because it shows you something about this case. Even years later, the public pressure didn't fade. The family didn't stop fighting, and community response remained intense. Then came another major legal development, this time in civil court. In November 2024, a federal jury awarded $98.65 million in damages to Botham Jean's family and estate, finding that Geiger used excessive force and violated his constitutional rights. That verdict was massive not just in amount, but in what it signaled, a formal legal condemnation of the force used in that apartment. Now, money can't restore a life, but civil verdicts often do something criminal sentencing can't do. They carve the event into the record in a different way, with a different burden and a different kind of public messaging. And in this case, the message was blunt. What happened in that apartment was not reasonable. This is where Dark Trace doesn't just retell the case. We extract value from it. Because the reason people share cases like this isn't entertainment. It's recognition. It's a warning. It's the need to name what happened when the official language tries to smooth it over. This case landed the way it did because it violated something primal. If you can't be safe in your own home, what does safety even mean? The public reaction wasn't only about the trigger pull. It was about the idea that an ordinary black man could be sitting in his living room and still be treated like a threat because someone else's fear arrived armed. A mistake doesn't erase responsibility. A mistake can explain how you got to the door, but it doesn't automatically justify what you chose once the door opened. This case forced a question people often avoid. When someone holds state authority, training, weapon, badge, should the standard be higher, not lower? Forgiveness is personal. Accountability is structural. Botham Jean's forgiveness was his. It was a family's faith and pain expressed in a way many people will never fully understand. But the backlash was also real, because many viewers felt the culture celebrates forgiveness more loudly than it demands institutional change. Both truths can exist at once. Reform only matters if it changes behavior. Texas lawmakers passed legislation known as the Botham Jean Act, HB 929, tied to law enforcement policies and procedures around recordings/body-worn cameras and related accountability mechanisms. Laws don't heal grief, but they can narrow the space where the next tragedy becomes possible. Botham Jean was not a headline first that he was a son, a brother, a friend, a man building a future. And the fact that his life ended in the place he should have been safest is exactly why people still say his name. If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe accountability matters, then help this story travel farther than the excuses. Subscribe to Dark Trace Crime Stories. Share this episode. And in the comments, answer this. What is the most suspicious or most unforgivable detail in this case to you? Is it the entry, the decision to shoot, the way the narrative shifted, the courtroom comfort, the witness aftershock? Because silence is how systems reset, and we're not here to forget.